Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is the Erickson Report, and I'm your host. My name's Larry Erickson, and for the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that I think you might want to know about, might be interested in hearing about. If you have any comments, questions, reactions to the show, by all means, you can contact me. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Again, that's my personal email, so you can reach me there if you have any reactions or questions or whatever. So let's get started. I'm going to start here. I'm going to start here by telling you that in this show, I am not going to be talking about El Paso. I am not going to be talking about Dayton, except to say this. I don't want to hear a thing. I don't want to hear a single damn thing about the thoughts and prayers of the right-wing bozos, bigots, hypocrites, liars, and twits lamely trying to act like they actually care or they give a damn about the carnage for which they are responsible because of their resistance to change and resistance to action. I was also going to call them dipwads, actually, but I decided not to because that implies they're stupid. And they're not stupid. They're not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing. They just lack sufficient humanity or conscience to care what they're doing. It's right on schedule. As sure as the sun rises in the morning, they blame mass shootings on things like video games, as Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy did, with Patrick dragging in online bullying and lack of school prayer for a good measure. Or they insisted it's all a mental health issue, as Texas Governor Greg Abbott did, as Tweety Pie himself did, along with acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, otherwise known as Major Tote from Raiders of the Lost Ark. While, of course, across all this, faux news insists that now is not the time to talk about gun violence. They're not stupid. They know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. It's just that they are eager, they are intent on, they are desperate to talk about something, anything at all, other than the guns. So I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to do instead is to refer you to something I did a little over a year ago. It was a special half-hour report on guns. And the website you see on the screen over here will be up for the entire show. It's a page from my website. Go there and you'll see two posts. One of them, the video version of that report, the other, the text version, which includes links to the sources that were used. And I will let that, for now, be my statement. All right, so next, let's get to this. We have a semi-regular feature. It's called 5 Things Noted in Passing. There's far more news in 2 weeks than you could possibly get to in a half-hour show. And I like to pick out 5 things that won't get a lot of time. I won't devote a lot of time to them, but I still wanted to make sure they got mentioned, okay? So, number 1, Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was visiting family in a place called Money, Mississippi in 1955, where he allegedly flirted with a white woman cashier at a country store. 4 days later, the woman's husband and brother went to the home where Till was staying. They kidnapped him, they stripped him, beat him nearly to death, gouged out an eye, shot him in the head, and threw his body tied to a 75-pound cotton gin fan with barbed wire into the Tallahatchie River. His body was found 4 days later. His murderers were put on trial and acquitted in less than 2 hours. Since 2007, there have been several memorial signs set up around the site of the murder. The signs have been repeatedly vandalized. But for some reason, a recent example is the one that caused extensive outrage. 3 University of Mississippi students were pictured themselves standing by one bullet-pocked sign wearing guns and grins. The result of this is that there's going to be a new sign there, 500 pounds, steel reinforced, bulletproof, and protected by security, which is apparently what it takes today to protect a memorial to a black child murdered by bigots 64 years ago. Number 2, to prove resistance can be joyful, Ronald Rail, a professor of architecture at the University of California, Berkeley, and Virginia Sanfratello, an associate professor of design at San Jose State University, have installed 3 pink seesaws along the steel border fence on the outskirts of El Paso in Texas and Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. The seesaws slid through the fence so that the 2 ends were in the different countries, making the wall, the professor said, a literal fulcrum of U.S.-Mexico relations. All right, number 3, the Polar Star is a heavy icebreaker designed to make its way through thick Antarctic ice, which can be over 20 feet thick. Its primary job is to clear a path for resupply of the McMurdo Research Station as part of Deep Freeze, a multi-service operation to support the U.S. Antarctic program, which is being run by the National Science Foundation. It's the U.S.'s only heavy icebreaker, and it was launched in 1976, 43 years ago. Every time it makes the trip, which is necessary to support the research being done at McMurdo, which can be done nowhere else in the world, things break down. Pipes leak, equipment stops working. The boat spends its entire time in downport in a struggle to get ready for the next voyage. Now, the Coast Guard and Navy are supposedly cooperating on plans for new heavy icebreakers. But every year, for now, there is the risk every year that the researchers at McMurdo will find themselves without supplies. Number 4, the case of Parvez Manzoor Khan is before a U.S. magistrate in Jacksonville, Florida. I won't try to go through the details of the case, which gets kind of complicated, but I wanted to mention it quickly because of its potential impact. The Justice Department is trying to strip Khan of his citizenship, which he obtained in 2006, on the grounds that on his application he failed to disclose aspects of his immigration history. However, it develops that even if he had revealed those aspects, it would not have prevented him from becoming a citizen. Despite that, the Justice Department is pursuing the case while admitting that if they're successful, ICE could possibly renew deportation proceedings against him. The important thing here, the important thing I wanted to mention, is that if Khan loses his citizenship, the DOJ has also made it clear that it intends to pursue similar cases against other naturalized citizens. I wonder if any of them will be from Norway. Number 5, finally, a study published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine compared state-by-state rates of gun ownership with rates of gun homicide for the years 1990 through 2016. The study found that the rate of domestic violence-related firearm murders was 65% higher in states with high rates of gun ownership than it was in states with lower rates of gun ownership, which I suppose should be filed under the heading, "And this is news exactly how." All right, and now for an occasional thing that we call heroes and villains. You may have heard about the massive protests in Moscow demanding free and fair elections in the wake of opposition candidates being barred from running in Moscow city council elections. The police response to what should have been no one's surprise has been brutal. Hundreds arrested this past weekend, 1,000 the weekend before, with many reported beaten as crowds called out, "We are unarmed and our blood is on your hands." In the midst of this state violence, 17-year-old Olga Misik sat down on the ground in her bulletproof vest in front of a line of Putin's armed goons and read aloud the Russian Constitution, including Article 31, which affirms the right of peaceful political assembly, creating a quiet but potent symbol of peaceful defiance. And what again should have been a surprise to no one, Misik was allowed to leave the demonstration only to be arrested later when there were no witnesses around. She was held overnight, she was beaten, and then she was charged with attending a public event held without filing a notice and fomenting mass unrest. for being a symbol of courageous, nonviolent defiance that has been compared to the famous image of a single Chinese man facing down a tank in Tiananmen Square, Olga Misik is a hero. As for our villain, well, yeah, enough of him. Enough of him. I want to follow up on something. I want to follow up on something I referred to last time when I expressed my outrage over a school district in Florida that threatened parents who hadn't paid a debt for their children's school lunches with having those children removed to foster care. But the real outrage, I said then, was that any family should ever find itself in the position of not being able to afford food for their children. That, however, it turns out, is not an outrage to the administration of Tweety Pie. For 2 decades, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, still commonly known by its original name of food stamps, has had rules which allow states to raise limits on eligibility, making it easier for families with high housing or child care costs or medical costs, as well as those with some savings and some assets, to still be able to qualify. Such loosened limits are now in effect to some degree in some form in 40 states, allowing them to better support low-income working families, helping those families build assets, and improving state administration while lowering administrative costs. But now, the gang of misanthropes who've sworn fealty to his high orangeness wants to dump those rules, denying states the ability to address local situations. Too often, I'm quoting here, too often states have misused this flexibility. That's from Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue, forgetting, it seems, that flexibility for states is actually a right-wing mantra, always invoked whenever they think states will be harder on poor people than a related federal program would be. But Perdue, for his part, considered families not being forced to choose among rent, healthcare, and food. He considers that an abuse. The White House gangsters estimated that 3.1 million people would lose access to food stamps under their proposal, which is evil enough. But it turns out that they left something out, which brings us back directly to school lunches. The plan would potentially strip around 500,000 children of their free school lunches. See, children automatically qualify for free school lunch if their families receive food stamps, a policy that reduces paperwork and thus both reduces costs and the risk of bureaucratic screw-ups. The proposed change would eliminate the automatic eligibility, forcing every family to apply individually under tightened standards. For some reason, the Death Eaters in the White House never mentioned that fact, never mentioned stripping 500,000 kids of their school lunches in their formal proposal of the program. Maybe they thought announcing an intention to deny school meals to 500,000 poor kids was too bad an image even for them to present. But frankly, I doubt that. Nothing seems beneath them. Let's take a break. And we are back, and we're going to be back with taking a longer look at BDS and Israel. We need to do this because the right to engage in peaceful political boycotts is under attack in the United States. Or, to be more precise, it's under attack if the target of your political boycott is the state of Israel. 27 states, covering more than 250 million Americans, have laws that in some way punish people or businesses or both for daring to engage in or support any sort of economic boycott of Israel, even if that boycott is limited to the occupied territories which Israel holds and controls in clear violation of international law and UN resolutions. These laws are part of a nationwide assault on the Boycott, Divest, Sanction, or BDS movement, the goal of which is to use economic pressure to force Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. The attacks in the movement are mostly based on taking some very clearly anti-Semitic statements from one of the founders of the movement and projecting those attitudes onto every single person, every single business, and every single group supporting that boycott, purposefully forgetting that BDS is a movement. It's not an organization, it's a movement. Congress has played its part as well. Last year, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, sponsored by two R's and two D's, tried to flat out make it a crime to boycott Israel. It failed, but there's talk of it being brought up again this year. This session has seen Senate passage of the Combat BDS Act, which encourages states to create the very sort of anti-boycott laws that 3 federal courts have now found to be unconstitutional. In late July, the House easily passed HRES 24, House Resolution 24, which condemned BDS, claiming the movement, quoting, promotes principles of collective guilt, mass punishment, and group isolation. Among those voting aye on this measure were progressive heroes Ro Khanna and Ayanna Pressley, who were described by some on Twitter as being progressive, except when it comes to Israel and Palestine. And by the way, this is important. I want to note that the exact description of BDS that was used could have been applied to the anti-apartheid movement directed against South Africa, as well as any number of other political boycotts. Remember the economic boycott of North Carolina over its anti-transgender so-called bathroom bill law? Remember that? Couldn't that economic boycott of North Carolina involve collective guilt and mass punishment? Now, happily, there's some pushback against this. Representatives Ilhan Omar, John Lewis, and Rasheda Talib have introduced a resolution reaffirming the First Amendment right to peaceful economic boycott as grounded in America's history. Lewis's support is particularly noteworthy because he opposes BDS, but he opposes restrictions on our constitutional rights even more. Pressley, for her part, tried to defend her vote to condemn BDS by pointing to her support for this resolution, but doing that shows either low-grade CYA or a fundamental ignorance of the issues at hand. All right, so why is something like BDS called for? Let me give you 2 recent reasons. According to the conservative Israeli newspaper, the Jerusalem Post, thousands of Gazans protest along the security fence on a weekly basis, calling for an end to the 12-year-long Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip. The security fence it refers to is this fence that Israel's built basically in order to cage in the people of the Gaza Strip. Israel has responded to the protests violently. According to a UN report, between March 30th, 2018, when the series of demonstrations started, and the end of that year, Israeli snipers killed 180 unarmed Palestinians and wounded more than 6,100 others. Quoting the report, the Israeli security forces killed and maimed Palestinian demonstrators who did not pose an imminent threat of death or serious injury to others when they were shot, nor were they directly participating in hostilities. And now, to prove how decent and moral they are, Israeli officials have said that snipers are going to aim at the ankles of protesters rather than shooting them anywhere in the body because of the unfortunate tendency of the previous policy to kill people. As noted by John Heller, an associate professor of international law at the University of Amsterdam, quoting him, Israel's most moral IDF admits sniping legs has an unfortunate tendency to kill, so it instructs its snipers to shoot at ankles. Shooting innocent protesters, however, is still fine. The Israeli civil rights organization B'Tselem declared that the change in policy, quoting them, in no way suggests that the military attaches great value to human life. On the contrary, it shows that the military consciously chose not to regard those standing on the other side of the fence as humans. And then we switch from Gaza, which has been rightly called the largest open-air prison in the world, to Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank, where on July 22nd, Israeli forces demolished dozens of homes in Sur Bahar, which is a Palestinian village that straddles East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Parts of Sur Bahar lie inside the municipal boundary of East Jerusalem, which is, again, under Israeli occupation. It's a disputed area. But parts lie inside the municipal boundary of East Jerusalem, and parts lie outside the apartheid wall that Israel has built between itself and the people of the West Bank. However, some parts of this village lie between those. That is, they lie outside the boundary of Jerusalem, but are still inside the wall. Because the wall there, as it does in a number of other places, wrongly intrudes into the West Bank. Now, because, however, this area is outside the boundary of Jerusalem, ostensibly it is under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. But Israel doesn't care. It declared those houses illegal because they lacked Israeli building permits, which first are almost impossible for Palestinians to get, and which of course ignores the fact that, again, the area is supposed to be under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority, not Israel. It also declared these houses a security risk because of their proximity to the fence, a risk, never forget, that Israel created by building the fence in the first place, and then used those excuses to demolish the homes and drive out the residents. The move was denounced by Amnesty International, calling it, quoting, part of a systematic pattern by Israeli authorities to forcibly displace Palestinians in the occupied territories, which the group said amounted to war crimes. In a joint statement, 3 key officials of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs declared that, quote, Israel's policy of destroying Palestinian property is not compatible with its obligations under international law. And the European Union issued a statement opposing the operation, which said, in part, quoting again, Israel's settlement policy, including actions taken in that context, such as forced transfers, evictions, demolitions, and confiscations of homes, is illegal under international law. Okay, if you think that shooting unarmed protesters and creating the largest open-air prison in the world, if you think that an ongoing policy that amounts to war crimes is in violation of international law and amounts to at least a type of ethnic cleansing, if you think all of that is not a valid basis for an economic boycott, especially directed against a nation whose leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, has already proven himself a liar and a hypocrite over the two-state solution in which our own leaders claim so fervently to believe, if you believe all of that is not a sufficient basis for an economic boycott, then I would challenge you to come up with a program for justice in the Middle East that does not involve suppression of constitutional rights here, and passive submission by Palestinians, dreamy wishful thinking, blind trust in those who have proven their bad faith or willful blindness, and probably all three there. I will just tell you that if you try, you will fail. All right, now it's time for our regular feature, 2 weeks of stupid clowns and outrages. Starting as usual with the clowns, our first clown is the poor, beleaguered Susan Collins. Her approval rating among her constituents in Maine has plummeted from a sky-high 78% at some point in 2015 to being underwater now, 45% approval, 48% disapproval. That's a fact which she blames on unceasing attacks by dark money groups. But however, she apparently does not see any connection between her plummeting support and her having sold her soul to Tweety Pie, particularly with her vote to put Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court after her risible claim that she was sure, oh so sure, that he would never, how could you even possibly think that he ever would vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. Making her even more of a clown is the fact that she herself has already benefited from dark money, and that of the $2 million she raised last quarter for her re-election campaign, less than $100,000 actually came from Maine. Our loser clown of the week is Representative John Ratcliffe, who auditioned for the post of Director of National Intelligence by berating Robert Mueller during his testimony before Congress by falsely claiming that Mueller had not followed special counsel regulations. Of course, in the wake of that act, Ratcliffe's name shot up Tweety Pie's list, and his high orangeness announced on July 28th that he was going to nominate Ratcliffe for the Director of National Intelligence, only to change his mind just 5 days later when even Senate goppers could not stomach the idea of endorsing this unqualified prat. Now, with the withdrawal of the nomination, you may think having him here is kind of borderline irrelevant, but I just had to take the opportunity to point and laugh. All right, next up, our candidate for Least Self-Aware Award is William Perry Pendley, a right-wing lawyer and commentator who is the new head of the Bureau of Land Management. He has argued that climate science isn't real, that environmentalists want to destroy civilization, that diversity programs are killing people, and that the best thing for managing public lands is for the feds to sell off most of it. He also said in a 2018 interview that a real problem in government is that federal employees aren't held personally liable or personally responsible for the harm they do regarding federal land management. Well, considering what he said, he better hope his own standards don't apply to him, which of course they won't, but we can dream. Finally, I know I said I wasn't going to mention El Paso or Dayton, but I just came across this as I was preparing the show, and it's so jaw-droppingly stupid that I had to include it. Mike Huckleberry, Hound, insists there is only one thing that can put a stop to mass shootings. Oh, what's that? Banning guns? Don't be absurd. Oh, how about a ban on military or assault-type weapons then? Nope, forget it. Universal background checks? A ban on large-capacity magazines? Nope, nope. No, not even better mental health programs or a ban on video games. The only thing that will help is, wait for it, thoughts and prayers. No joke, that's what he said in so many words. Adding that until, quoting now, kids are brought up once again to believe that we are all made in the image of God, that life is sacred, and superficial differences like skin color are meaningless. And I don't know when he thinks kids were actually brought up that way, but if he does, I want some of what he's been smoking. Anyway, until we are all again apparently pacifists and completely non-racist, passing more laws is just rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. In other words, Mike Huckleberry Hound is saying, I don't give a damn and stop bothering me. Turning to our outrages, we have first the fact that the Treaty Pie administration has announced plans to resume executing federal prisoners, ending a 16-year moratorium on the practice. Attorney General William Barr ordered the Bureau of Prisons to schedule executions for 5 inmates now on death row, bringing back the Grim Reaper with a vengeance, because the federal government has carried out only 3 executions since the federal law on it was expanded in 1994, and the last of those was in 2003. This bloodlust flies in the face of the trend of the nation as a whole. There were just 25 executions in the whole of the country in 2018, a quarter of those of 20 years earlier. New Hampshire abolished the death penalty in May, making it the 21st state to do so. In some of the other states where it remains the law, the death penalty is essentially frozen either by a governor moratorium or a court decision, and in yet others where it exists, it's just never enforced. Popular support for capital punishment is also down, dropping from 80% in the mid-1990s, when fear of crime and actual crime rates are much higher, to just 54% now. Amnesty International called the decision to resume sanctioned murder outrageous, which I would say is the least you can call it. The fact is, despite the lack of any evidence that the death penalty reduces the murder rate, despite the demonstrated racial and economic biases in imposition of the death penalty, despite the cold reality of the execution of innocent people, despite dropping crime and dropping support, the remnants of this barbarity exist. It was and it remains an outrage. All right, that's it. That's it for now. We're just going to have to go and leave it at that. We'll see you in 2 weeks, okay? But for now, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.